Welcome to another edition of the Florida Chamber's Bottom Line. I'm Edie Owsley, Vice President of Public Affairs at the Florida Chamber, and joining us today is Matt Dixon, Senior Reporter with Politico Florida. Welcome to the program, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
We're in the last 3 weeks of the legislative session, and there's been a lot of coverage about the dynamics between the Florida House, Florida Senate, and Governor Scott, particularly as it relates to important economic development issues like Enterprise Florida, Visit Florida. There's also Lake Okeechobee and higher education. From your vantage point, what are you seeing from a dynamic perspective that's really playing out?
Well, this is typically the time of year where the House and the Senate can't generally agree on what day of the week it is. As we get to the end of session here, bills and amendments will be filed that are sometimes almost intentionally just to make their bill different than, a House will file an amendment to make their bill different than the Senate. And part of that's very strategic. A lot of this is about leverage. You can't, even if you agree on a policy issue, you can't necessarily have two bills that line up because you lose a little leverage in the process. And as the final weeks and the final days of session approach, you kind of want to have as much as you can over the other guy. As far as the economic development issues that I think you're talking about, Enterprise Florida, Visit Florida, the governor and the Senate have largely been on sort of the same wavelength. And it's a classic example of, if you think of state government as a stool with three legs, there's the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. Oftentimes two will team up on one on various issues. Sessions are marked by the House fighting with two or the Senate fighting with two. And this year it's the governor and the Senate fighting with the House over some of these economic development issues, with the House wanting to essentially do away with all of them, and the Senate wanting to fund them and protect them, much like Governor Scott does, who is a big proponent of some of those programs.
So Matt, you're one of the leading reporters that's covering the Florida legislature, and I know you've been doing this for more than 7 years now. As you cover the legislature, we are seeing news reports even coming from the likes of Wall Street Journal that are really pointing to how some Republicans are embracing trial lawyer issues. And just last week, we saw Dr. Susan McManus, who's a political scientist with USF. She talked about how the Florida legislature is looking more like Washington, D.C. Why do you think that there's a split between or in the Republican Party? And it does at least give the appearance that it's Republicans fighting Republicans. What are you seeing?
I think one thing, Tallahassee can never be like Washington in the sense that they have to pass a budget every year. But Washington at points, Congress at points can't even pass a budget. And in essentially a 2-month period here, Florida passes an $83 billion budget in hundreds of bills. So there's always going to be a bit of difference there. But the underlying, from a 10,000-foot perspective, I think the observation's an apt one. There's been one-party control here for 2 decades essentially, and eventually politics is a sort of a sharp-elbowed, pugilistic sport. And eventually, even if there's the same letter next to someone's name, fights are going to happen. This is a natural process where people fight over policy and people fight over budget issues. So I think that's largely what we're seeing. And to your point about the trial lawyers, I think outside of the Capitol, politically on the campaign trail, they've done a very good job of getting Republican attorneys and attorneys who are more, or Republicans who are more sympathetic to some of their issues that you guys might not agree with, elected. And right now they have the best legislature and the best two presiding officers they've had in a very long time. And I think there's going to be some inherent tension with more traditionally pro-business Republicans and some of the Republicans that the trial lawyers have done a pretty good job of getting elected. And that's probably spurring some of what we're seeing this year specifically. But to a larger context, I think just when there's one-party rule, there's generally going to be some infighting.
Well, when we think about those pro-business issues, issues like workers' comp reform, reforming the fraud and abuse, which is in assignment of benefits, a property insurance issue, do you think with 3 weeks left that those issues, that we're going to see legislation pass and come across the finish line?
I'm skeptical that issues that for either side that is going to be able to get a win, because I'm not sure the bills can pass. The legislature is often not designed to deal with issues that big in one session. It's often an incremental process. Sort of the cliche is kick the can down the road. And I'm with 3 weeks left and with many other things out there, those are some of the most contentious issues. So I've been wrong a lot, but my initial gut is that I'm skeptical that bills like that can pass. I just think the term is sort of heavy and they sometimes die in their own way, and the House and the Senate have still pretty big disagreements. There's a lot of third-party interest, as you well know. So those always generally make a recipe for bills perhaps staying alive until the last day of session, but not necessarily passing. And they could pass, but my guess at this point would be that I would go the other way.
Well, certainly at the Florida Chamber, one thing that we don't do is give up, and certainly we'll be fighting for the last 3 weeks here as we have been. What can Florida Chamber members and partners do to help ensure that lawmakers do address these important issues?
Well, anytime I'm asked that by any group, period, regardless of ideology or special interest, it's just call your lawmakers. That's, generally, if they hear from enough people, it gets in their head and gets in their ear, and then they'll go into a committee room, they'll go on the floor and say, I've been hearing from so-and-so, and that offers them sort of fodder to push your position or gives them backup and momentum for something they believe in to take to the floor. So like I would tell anyone, it's just contact your members.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And to you, our viewers, thank you for joining us on another edition of the Florida Chamber's Bottom Line.